Book Talk begins at 12 minutes and 17 seconds. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 659. But have you tried yoga? This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our wonderful patrons at patreon.com and our members over on the YouTube channel membership. This week, we would like to highlight Donna Moore, Nina, Julie, Jennifer Gordon, Yanlei, and a new patron, Jonna Roseball. Thank you so much for your support. We could not do this without you, and it brings me so much joy to be able to do this, so thank you. Well, hello, how are you? I slept last night, so I'm feeling pretty darn good. After having a day and a half of really raging headaches today, so far, I'm okay. I'm also seeing the speech therapist later today, and then I have a yoga class. If you've been listening to CraftLit for a long time, you may have noticed that I have never spoken much about exercise at all. I don't like gyms. I don't like working out. I like learning things. So I like dance classes, but I'm 5'8", and so the other girls can jeter across the floor 17 times and I can do it twice. So I didn't take a whole lot of dance classes except at UCLA. But one of the Substack writers, Amy at the Tonic, the THE Tonic, TONIC. Amy is kind of our people. Smart, funny, bookish, also has had long COVID for 3+ years now, I believe. She has a fantastic article on but have you tried yoga? Because she constantly was getting people coming up to her and going, wow, you have this really debilitating disease that's neurophysical and nobody really knows how to fix it. Have you tried yoga? And like me, her response to this is typically, thanks. And then you just change the subject. She, however, found a yoga class. And so I am sharing this with you. I'm putting a link into the show notes to sign up for this class. I am telling you right now, it is I guess it's technically an affiliate link. No, it's a referral link. So I get something. The person who uses the link, and as many people can use the link as you want, it's not limited. People who use it, I think you either get a free or a really radically discounted first class. I will tell you this. I am unemployed. I am not on disability. These classes are not horribly expensive. And you can do like one class at a time or one class whenever you have the time /money/inclination, or you can sign up for a monthly kind of subscription. And that includes not just your yoga class on Wednesdays at 1, which is 1 p.m. Eastern time, but it also includes hanging around for about half an hour or so after the class so you can ask questions of both the woman who's giving the class and other people who are in the class. And the reason why this matters is because the woman who is teaching this has ME, myalgic encephalitis, and ME/CFS has been going on forever, but practically no money has been put into researching this because, let's be honest, it's mostly women. And I don't often go down this road, but I know I did before on the podcast about the whole growing up and learning that if you have pain in your left arm, that's an indication that you might be having a heart attack. And then they found out, well, actually, no, not for half of the population of the planet. True for men, not so much for women. Because why study women? I mean, we're the same, right? So there hasn't been a lot of money put into ME/CFS research. Long COVID comes along, and there are many similarities between the two. So I think ME/CFS has, over the last 10 years, gotten like something ridiculous, like $100,000 in research money. It's not a lot. Maybe that's since long COVID started. So then long COVID comes along, and lo and behold, a lot of doctors and nurses and researchers have gotten long COVID, and therefore men have also gotten it. And that has meant that there's more money going into funding research. And while the ME/CFS and the long COVID diseases, the things that are causing the dis-ease, are different, they are related. And they seem to be post-viral syndromes of different sorts. Why does this matter? Number one, just because you don't have long COVID or ME/CFS doesn't mean you shouldn't be aware of this. I can't believe nobody is talking about this. Almost every virus that goes around has caused a post-viral syndrome in somebody at some time, because viruses are weird and they're smart. I mean, they're not like little bacteria that go in and eat stuff. They replicate. They want to eat you. It's a horrible way to put it. They have a lifespan. They want to make that lifespan count. So it can be as little as, well, I got over viral pneumonia 2 months ago. I can breathe now, but I still feel like fill in the blank. I can't sleep, or I sleep all the time, or I'm exhausted, or I can't think straight. And gradually it goes away. Long COVID, for people who got it in the beginning, has not gone away as far as I can tell. Almost everybody who I've gotten in touch with who still has long COVID, those are people who got it before the vaccines came out. Anybody who's gotten it after the vaccines, you have a much higher chance of recovering at some point. It could take 2 years. I am on my year and a month anniversary of knowing that I had long COVID. So I have a ways to go. But the reason I bring it up is I said the woman who gives that yoga class had ME. She has largely recovered from it, but I put that in air quotes because you can always have these relapses because viral syndromes are weird. What this means, though, practically is if you or someone in your family or your circle of friends is, for whatever reason, not able to do a regular yoga class, and by that I mean standing up and sitting down and getting up on your knees and doing cow-cat pose, or doing basically anything other than child's pose, or doing downward effing dog, any of these things, if they can't do it, this is the class for them, because it gets your blood circulating, it gets you feeling like you're doing something, it gets you breathing in different ways, which is so good for you. And it doesn't make you feel stupid, because half of the people are on their Zoom camera while we're doing the class so you can see other people. Half of them are lying down on their side because that's as much as they can do that day. Some of them can roll over and do parts of the exercises. Some of them can't. And the most wonderful thing is this teacher just says, if you can't if you can't roll over onto your knees because of POTS, here's what to do. If you can't move this way, here's the way you can modify it. If you're feeling up to it, extend your leg all the way. So there's constant adjustments being made for everybody's needs. I've never experienced anything like this. I love it so much. And I just wanted to share that. Yes, it is annoying to have people say, wow, totally debilitating disease. Have you tried yoga? But at the same time, darn it, apparently yoga is good. Oh, I should be more embarrassed than I am, but I'm not. I know I'm not alone. So there's that. The other thing I need to tell you is we have a winner from our May. I cannot keep track of time anymore. Our May raffle. The winner is Jennifer G. And Amy should have already gotten in touch with you at this point to tell you that your stuff is coming. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please tag us on Instagram. And I think Instagram is still just H. Ordover. It's just me. But you can hashtag CraftLit. There are hashtags around there. We're still trying to get the CraftLit Instagram handle. Someday go look at what's on the Instagram, or at the CraftLit Instagram channel, and laugh with me. Maybe if we all bug him, he'll give it up and let me have it now. It's been a while since he's posted. Anyway, this month we have a new raffle. This one is pretty special. This one is actually donated by Andrew. I know, my Andrew. So this month we are raffling off something called the Author Clock. I have a box. It is unopened. It is brand spanking new, and it's called Author Clock. Every minute has a story. If you're watching on YouTube, you are looking at 9 minutes and 21 seconds. This is almost a live feed from my author clock. Andrew accidentally got two. These were Kickstarters. And every 3 minutes, the screen changes and presents another piece of text from a book that refers to that particular time. So this first one from 921 is James Twinning, The Double Eagle. And there's a random quote, well, not a random quote, a quote that has 9:21 a.m. actually written into it. Every 3 minutes, it's going to change. So it'll change right then to 9:26. And this one is from Gillian Flynn, Dark Places, or Gillian Flynn. I don't know how she pronounces it. Gillian Flynn. Anyway, and you will see 9:26 features prominently and is bolded on the screen of the clock. So it's not the kind of thing you want to post on the wall because it's obviously going to be hard to read. And you can see one of my creepy crochet guys next to the clock. It's not particularly tall. It's not more than 5 inches tall, but it has a USB-C charger that it comes with. The charge lasts forever, which I love. And the setup is relatively simple. I can't show you that because if I try and reset mine, then I'm going to get into a loop. But it has you can see a little dial on the right-hand side that lets you switch menu items, and then you can push that dial knob in, and that's how you select things. And all it wants to do is hook up to your home Wi-Fi, and then it's good to go. Yeah, so we're raffling this baby off this month for our June raffle. Ah, so hard to keep track of time. So yes, there will be a link in the show notes. There will be a picture in the show notes of this particular clock, but there will be a link in the show notes for you to follow to the Rafflecopter site where you can sign up. And again, you just do any of the things that it says on the Rafflecopter thing. Yes, I signed up for this, or yes, I shared it this way. And that equals an entry into our giveaway. So I think that's all the good stuff. That's all the fun stuff. That's all the stuff. So this week, we have 2 chapters from Jane Austen's Emma. We have volume 2, chapters 4 and 5, or chapters 22 and 23 in Emma. And today, we've been waiting for these chapters for a little while. So I'm very excited. The first chapter is not very long. The second chapter is about normal length. And we're only going to do 2 today. Some things to be aware of before we dive in. Rencontre. Rencontre is honestly, it's a snooty way of saying re-encountered. Okay, let's just be honest, Heather. Let's be honest with the nice listeners. Don't lie to them. This is some of the snarkiest Jane Austen writing I have seen, and that says a lot. She is talking about Mr. Elton, and she's talking about Mr. Elton's fiancé. I think I misspoke last week and said that they were married. They're not married yet. They have to get married. So we're in the process of that. And Jane Austen has several very pointed ways that she indicates that Elton is really tap dancing on Emma's last nerve. Some of it, Emma actually says out loud, like really she can deal with not seeing him any too soon for a good long time. But she also does things like using the accidental rencontre, the snooty way of saying re-encountered, a dinner at Miss Green's and then a party at Mrs. Brown's, which is like doing and then I went to yada yada's house, and then I went to blah blah's house, and la 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 la, retelling somebody else's story of how fabulous their time was over in somebody's chateau for the summer. It's both snotty and also kind of funny to hear it coming out of Emma, somebody who's very privileged and who knows it. But yeah, she just can't be bothered right now. She's really ticked off at Elton. The word pique, I don't think this is the first time I've even brought it up on this book. Pique. I love the word pique. I need to start using it more. In this case, think of it as resentment, like not quite angry resentment, but irked resentment. And there's a phrase that he has this manner of pique, this pretension, now spread over his air. We've heard, I know, hundreds of times, an air of beauty or an air of grace or whatever. It turns out that use of the word air is actually more specific than I had initially thought. It almost has a moral tint to it about how one behaves in society. You don't want to come across as big, heavy, bombastic, loud. You want to have an air of these, well, none of those things, but an air of gentility, an air of beauty. It's less overtly in your face than somebody walking up and going, "Hey, how are you?" I hope I didn't make you jump too hard on that. Then we get into the real snarky bit. And this is one of those places where I've warned you about and talked about, where Jane Austen is expecting her readers to know things. These ones are good. I'm not going to spoil anything by telling you that Emma has no great thought about Mr. Elton's betrothed, but it's very specific because, of course, she's comparing this new woman who she hasn't met yet to Harriet, who is beautiful and lovely and kind and gentle and sweet and dim, but really just a lovely person. And Elton has thrown Harriet over for this woman. It did not appear she was Harriet's superior. She brought no name, so she did not connect it to a big family, no blood, no bloodline, no alliance, no other family connections that could make her of use. I put that in air quotes to Elton. Miss Augusta Hawkins was the youngest of the two daughters of a Bristol M dash merchant. Of course he must be called. Okay. Right there, there's an M dash right after the word Bristol and before the word merchant. Something is fishy with that. And here's what that fishiness is. Bristol at the time, historically, but also at this time, was known to, at this point, have been, because I think it was 1807. Is that right? 1807 is when the anti-slavery legislation was passed in England. I think it was 1807. It's been a minute since slavery was outlawed in England. We in America still had a long way to go. But Bristol was one of those ports where slave ships came in and unloaded and reloaded and went across to the West Indies. Bristol was therefore kind of notorious. So if you were a merchant, I'm sorry, M dash merchant, there's every likelihood that this is Jane Austen, not just casting aspersions, not just raising an eyebrow in kind of mock chagrin, but actually letting you know there's something in this woman's past. There's every chance that there's something in this woman's past that is not quite genteel. It's not quite a pig with lipstick, but it's not all that far off. She is not anticipating anything great. And of course, for Emma, also, the fact that he'd be considered a merchant is already kind of it's even a step down for Mr. Elton, technically, in our very, very classed society. Jane has Emma go on and snark even more. There's more. That is just the beginning of the major attack. And then there's italics used when discussing Miss Hawkins' older sister, who was very well married, all italicized, to a gentleman in a great way, also italicized. So now we're just being catty. And she still lived near Bristol, who kept 2 carriages. We already know how expensive it can be to keep a carriage. So keeping 2 carriages is it's really kind of over the top, which makes me think this is Jane Austen's way of saying, wow, new money. This is somebody who had money and wanted to show that they had money, and therefore they're spending that money in ways that one might find appalling. That don't make a show of your religion. There's the corollary, don't make a show of your money. This family is having a hard time with that. And then she says at the end of this long screed, that was the windup of the history. That was the glory of Miss Hawkins. The windup of the history, that's wrapping it all up. That's it in a nutshell. You now know everything you need to know about Miss Hawkins before meeting her. And I want to talk more about these kinds of snap judgments and prejudices after the chapter today, because I think that whole mindset really starts to be important in today's, well, it's important in a lot of chapters, but also in today's chapters. Then in chapter 23, there is a reference to the White Hart in Bath. So the White Hart was an inn and a carriage house that was directly across the street, or almost directly across the street from the pump house. And if you're watching YouTube, you will see the picture. If you are listening to the podcast, you will see this picture in your show notes, or a link out to this picture, at least in your show notes. This carriage house was eventually ripped down and rebuilt as the Grand Pump Room Hotel, which I think has subsequently been torn down and is now something else. But if you are looking at this picture, you'll see there is a white hart, a white deer, a stag. It looks like it might be a fountain, but I don't know that it actually is. It would make sense if it was, but I'm not sure. But it's up on a pedestal in the open air market. And Jane Austen actually mentions this place in a letter to Cassandra, that she has a friend who's staying in Bath who was staying at the White Hart Inn and not feeling well, and that the noise from the carriage house portion of this place was just appalling and making it very hard for her to get better. So that's the White Hart. It isn't there anymore, but it was well known. And if you look at this picture, you will see it is really, really big. I think the carriagey stable parts are off on the left side of this picture. There appear to be some colonnades that you could probably walk through to some other room that would be used for keeping horses and things like that. Espalier, apple trees, or espalier. So espaliers are both the stakes that one would use to make this kind of a trellis structure with fruit trees, but it is also the word that's used to describe this kind of structure. Again, whether you're on YouTube or looking at the show notes, you will be able to see it's like a bower. It's beautiful. It's an archway, a walking tunnel, a beautiful idea of apple trees. Usually this is done with apple or pear trees, which make it, number one, very easy for you to walk along underneath and pick an apple if it's ripe. And that's marvelous. But the other thing about this is, by talking about somebody who has created an espalier in their front yard, which is where you'll hear it referred to, it takes about 5 to 7 years to get one of these things cooking. So it is not for nothing that this is mentioned. This is telling us that the person who did this is steadfast, they are smart, they are careful, and that they care a great deal about what they do. And that is absolutely dead on what you're supposed to get out of this. I've never even heard of this. Espalier evidently comes from another word in Italian that's actually referring to what sounds like a picture rail, but instead of a picture rail or a chair rail where you have the kind of wooden trim at the height of the chair, so that if you bump your chair into the wall, you don't dent the wall, you dent the wooden trim that you can take off. This is more like wainscoting or a rail that goes around at shoulder height, so that men could lean against the wall without smudging the wall up. And that's what an espalier came from. So really, it started out as the stakes, the pieces of wood that were used gradually to help raise the level of the trees. Now, there are pictures of other espaliers that you can find online that are done up against a wall. So they kind of create these amazing structures out of tree branches that are just wild. It's just wild. I didn't know anything about these. I'm fascinated. It's just awesome. You'll hear a reference to spending a quarter of an hour on a visit. And we hear all the time in these books about people going and calling on each other in the morning, and that's the proper thing to do. Really, I don't remember really having ever heard any kind of indication of the social respectability of certain times, staying there for certain periods of time. I was always sure there was, and I think in maybe one book we heard somebody who overstayed their welcome, but a quarter of an hour seemed awfully short to me. 15 minutes was the bare minimum that you could visit, call on somebody without it being questionable. It's something that you would do kind of perfunctorily. It's not somebody who you're going to see because they're a friend. So if you went less than 15 minutes, that is a statement. 20 minutes seems to have been a good average for somebody who you don't know very well, but who you think you might like. So yeah, just keep that in mind. 15 minutes is the cutoff for being polite. Anything less than that, not so polite, or at least not a friend. Just a geographical note, where we are is not where Hartfield and Highbury are south of London-ish. They're, I think Leatherhead is close. Bath is 80 some odd, 88 miles to the west of that. And Oxford is 48 miles northwest of that. So if you were going to travel from Oxford to London, first of all, of course, there are roads that just go straight along. That's a given. The all roads lead to London kind of thing. You all go up to the city. That's fine. But you wouldn't go 40 some miles to the south of you just so you could do 88 miles over to London if that was your end goal. So there's no chance that you're going to go from Oxford to Bath to somewhere near London unless you were a tourist and that was just the route you were taking. Nobody who wanted to get somewhere would go that direction. I'm just giving you a heads up. It goes along with the Harriet line, so it'll make sense when you get there. We learned in Northanger Abbey that people's characters are often determined by how they treat their horses, or the subtext that we get about characters is determined by how they treat their horses. Our bad guy in Northanger Abbey drove his horses too hard, too fast, and with too much weight. Today, you're going to hear about somebody who is traveling earlier, later, and quicker. This is a warning sign. Earlier and later could be just fine if you're not working the horse too hard. Earlier, later, and quicker, it's just something to keep in mind. That's all I'm saying. You're going to hear a reference to a mother-in-law. This is actually a stepmother. So don't let that throw you. You're going to hear it and go, wait, mother-in-law? They're not married. And stepmother. And that's it. Let's listen to our 2 chapters for today. Chapters 22 and 23, or Volume 2, Chapters 4 and 5 of Jane Austen's Emma. If you are listening to your own version of the story, please fast wind to 55 minutes and 16 seconds. All right, here we go.
Volume 2, Chapter 4. Human nature is so well disposed towards those who are in interesting situations that a young person who either marries or dies is sure of being kindly spoken of. A week had not passed since Miss Hawkins's name was first mentioned in Highbury before she was, by some means or other, discovered to have every recommendation of person and mind, to be handsome, elegant, highly accomplished, and perfectly amiable. And when Mr. Elton himself arrived to triumph in his happy prospects and circulate the fame of her merits, there was very little more for him to do than to tell her Christian name and say whose music she principally played. Mr. Elton returned a very happy man. He had gone away rejected and mortified, disappointed in a very sanguine hope, after a series of what appeared to him strong encouragement, and not only losing the right lady, but finding himself debased to the level of a very wrong one. He had gone away deeply offended. He came back engaged to another, and to another as superior, of course, to the first, as under such circumstances what is gained always is to what is lost. He came back gay and self-satisfied, eager and busy, caring nothing for Miss Woodhouse, and defying Miss Smith. The charming Augusta Hawkins, in addition to all the usual advantages of perfect beauty and merit, was in possession of an independent fortune, of so many thousands as would be always called 10, a point of some dignity, as well as some convenience. The story told well. He had not thrown himself away. He had gained a woman of £10,000 or thereabouts, and he had gained her with such delightful rapidity, the first hour of introduction had been so very soon followed by distinguishing notice, the history which he had to give Mrs. Cole of the rise and progress of the affair was so glorious, the steps so quick, from the accidental rencontre to the dinner at Mr. Green's and the party at Mrs. Brown's, smiles and blushes rising in importance, with consciousness and agitation richly scattered, The lady had been so easily impressed, so sweetly disposed, had, in short, to use a most intelligible phrase, been so very ready to have him, that vanity and prudence were equally contented. He had caught both substance and shadow, both fortune and affection, and was just the happy man he ought to be, talking only of himself and his own concerns, expecting to be congratulated, ready to be laughed at, and with cordial, fearless smiles, now addressing all the young ladies of the place, to whom, a few weeks ago, he would have been more cautiously gallant. The wedding was no distant event, as the parties had only themselves to please, and nothing but the necessary preparations to wait for. And when he set out for Bath again, there was a general expectation, which a certain glance of Mrs. Cole's did not seem to contradict, that when he next entered Highbury he would bring his bride. During his present short stay, Emma had barely seen him, but just enough to feel that the first meeting was over, and to give her the impression of his not being improved by the mixture of pique and pretension now spread over his air. She was, in fact, beginning very much to wonder that she had ever thought him pleasing at all, and his sight was so inseparably connected with some very disagreeable feelings, that except in a moral light, as a penance, a lesson, a source of profitable humiliation to her own mind, she would have been thankful to be assured of never seeing him again. She wished him very well, but he gave her pain, and his welfare 20 miles off would administer most satisfaction. The pain of his continued residence in Highbury, however, must certainly be lessened by his marriage. Many vain solicitudes would be prevented, many awkwardnesses smoothed by it. A Mrs. Elton would be an excuse for any change of intercourse. Former intimacy might sink without remark. It would be almost beginning their life of civility again. Of the lady individually Emma thought very little. She was good enough for Mr. Elton, no doubt, accomplished enough for Highbury, handsome enough, to look plain, probably, by Harriet's side. As to connection, there Emma was perfectly easy, persuaded that after all his own vaunted claims and disdain of Harriet, he had done nothing. On that article truth seemed attainable. What she was must be uncertain, but who she was might be found out, and setting aside the £20,000, it did not appear that she was at all Harriet's superior. She brought no name, no blood, no alliance. Miss Hawkins was the youngest of the 2 daughters of a Bristol merchant. Of course he must be called. But as the whole of the profits of his mercantile life appeared so very moderate, it was not unfair to guess the dignity of his line of trade had been a very moderate also. Part of every winter she had been used to spend in Bath, but Bristol was her home, the very heart of Bristol, for though the father and mother had died some years ago, an uncle remained, in the law line. Nothing more distinctly honourable was hazarded of him than that he was in the law line, and with him the daughter had lived. Emma guessed him to be the drudge of some attorney, and too stupid to rise. And all the grandeur of the connection seemed dependent on the elder sister, who was very well married, to a gentleman in a great way, near Bristol, who kept 2 carriages. That was the wind-up of the history, that was the glory of Miss Hawkins. Could she but have given Harriet her feelings about it all! She had talked her into love, but alas, she was not so easily to be talked out of it. The charm of an object to accompany the many vacancies of Harriet's mind was not to be talked away. He might be superseded by another, he certainly would indeed, nothing could be clearer, even a Robert Martin would have been sufficient, but nothing else, she feared, would cure her. Harriet was one of those who, having once begun, would be always in love. And now, poor girl, she was considerably worse from this reappearance of Mr. Elton. She was always having a glimpse of him somewhere or other. Emma saw him only once, but 2 or 3 times every day Harriet was sure just to meet with him, or just to miss him, just to hear his voice or see his shoulder, just to have something occur to preserve him in her fancy, in all the favouring warmth of surprise and conjecture. She was, moreover, perpetually hearing about him, for, excepting when at Hartfield, she was always among those who saw no fault in Mr. Elton, and found nothing so interesting as the discussion of his concerns, and every report, therefore, every guess, all that had already occurred, all that might occur in the arrangement of his affairs, comprehending income, servants, and furniture, was continually in agitation around her. Her regard was receiving strength by invariable praise of him, and her regrets kept alive, and feelings irritated by ceaseless repetitions of Miss Hawkins's happiness, and continual observation of how much he seemed attached, his air as he walked by the house, the very sitting of his hat, being all in proof of how much he was in love. Had it been allowable entertainment, had there been no pain to her friend or reproach to herself in the waverings of Harriet's mind, Emma would have been amused by its variations. Sometimes Mr. Elton predominated, sometimes the Martins, and each was occasionally useful as a check to the other. Mr. Elton's engagement had been the cure of the agitation of meeting Mr. Martin. The unhappiness produced by the knowledge of that engagement had been a little put aside by Elizabeth Martin's calling at Mrs. Goddard's a few days afterwards. Harriet had not been at home, but a note had been prepared and left for her, written in the very style to touch, a small mixture of reproach, with a great deal of kindness, and till Mr. Elton himself appeared, she had been much occupied by it, continually pondering over what could be done in return, and wishing to do more than she dared to confess. But Mr. Elton in person had driven away all such cares. While he stayed, the Martins were forgotten, and on the very morning of his setting off for Bath again, Emma, to dissipate some of the distress it occasioned, judged it best for her to return Elizabeth Martin's visit. How that visit was to be acknowledged, what would be necessary, and what might be safest, had been a point of some doubtful consideration. Absolute neglect of the mother and sisters, when invited to come, would be ingratitude. It must not be, and yet the danger of a renewal of the acquaintance. After much thinking, she could determine on nothing better than Harriet's returning the visit, but in a way that, if they had understanding, should convince them that it was only to be a formal acquaintance. She meant to take her in the carriage, leave her at the Abbey Mill while she drove a little further, and call for her again so soon as to allow no time for insidious applications or dangerous recurrences to the past, and give the most decided proof of what degree of intimacy was chosen for the future. She could think of nothing better, and though there was something in it which her own heart could not approve, something of ingratitude merely glossed over, it must be done, or what would become of Harriet? End of Chapter 4. Volume 2, Chapter 5. Small Heart had Harriet for visiting. Only half an hour before her friend called for her at Mrs. Goddard's, her evil stars had led her to the very spot where, at that moment, a trunk, directed to the Reverend Philip Elton, White Hart, Bath, was to be seen under the operation of being lifted into the butcher's cart, which was to convey it to where the coaches passed, and everything in this world, excepting that trunk and the direction, was consequently a blank. She went, however, and when they reached the farm, and she was to be put down at the end of the broad, neat gravel walk which led between espalier apple trees to the front door, the sight of everything which had given her so much pleasure the autumn before was beginning to revive a little local agitation, and when they parted, Emma observed her to be looking around with a sort of fearful curiosity which determined her not to allow the visit to exceed the proposed quarter of an hour. She went on herself to give that portion of time to an old servant who was married and settled in Donwell. The quarter of an hour brought her punctually to the white gate again, and Miss Smith, receiving her summons, was with her without delay, and unattended by any alarming young man. She came solitarily down the gravel walk, a Miss Martin just appearing at the door, and parting with her seemingly with ceremonious civility. Harriet could not very soon give an intelligible account. She was feeling too much, but at last Emma collected from her enough to understand the sort of meeting and the sort of pain it was creating. She had seen only Mrs. Martin and the two girls. They had received her doubtingly, if not coolly, and nothing beyond the merest commonplace had been talked almost all the time, till just at last, when Mrs. Martin saying all of a sudden that she thought Miss Smith was grown, had brought on a more interesting subject and a warmer manner. In that very room she had been measured last September, with her two friends. There were the pencilled marks and memorandums on the wainscot by the window. He had done it. They all seemed to remember the day, the hour, the party, the occasion, to feel the same consciousness, the same regrets, to be ready to return to the same good understanding, and they were just growing again like themselves. Harriet, as Emma must suspect, as ready as the best of them to be cordial and happy, when the carriage reappeared, and all was over. The style of the visit and the shortness of it were then felt to be decisive. 14 minutes to be given to those with whom she had thankfully passed 6 weeks, not 6 months ago. Emma could not but picture it all, and feel how justly they might resent, how naturally Harriet must suffer. It was a bad business. She would have given a great deal, or endured a great deal, to have had the Martins in a higher rank of life. They were so deserving that a little higher should have been enough. But as it was, how could she have done otherwise? Impossible. She could not repent. They must be separated. But there was a great deal of pain in the process, so much to herself at this time that she soon felt the necessity of a little consolation, and resolved on going home by way of Randalls to procure it. Her mind was quite sick of Mr. Elton and the Martins. The refreshment of Randalls was absolutely necessary. It was a good scheme, but on driving to the door they heard that neither master nor mistress was at home. They had both been out some time. The man believed they were gone to Hartfield. "This is too bad," cried Emma as they turned away. "And now we shall just miss them. Too provoking. I do not know when I have been so disappointed." And she leaned back in the corner to indulge her murmurs or to reason them away, probably a little of both, such being the commonest process of a not ill-disposed mind. Presently the carriage stopped. She looked up. It was stopped by Mr. and Mrs. Weston, who were standing to speak to her. There was instant pleasure in the sight of them, and still greater pleasure was conveyed in sound, for Mr. Weston immediately accosted her with, "How do you do? How do you do? We have been sitting with your father. Glad to see him so well. Frank comes tomorrow. I had a letter this morning. We see him tomorrow by dinner-time to a certainty. He is at Oxford today, and he comes for a whole fortnight. I knew it would be so. If he had come at Christmas, he could not have stayed 3 days. I was always glad he did not come at Christmas. Now we are going to have just the right weather for him. Fine, dry, settled weather. We shall enjoy him completely. Everything has turned out exactly as we could wish." There was no resisting such news, no possibility of avoiding the influence of such a happy face as Mr. Weston's, confirmed as it all was by the words and the countenance of his wife, fewer and quieter, but not less to the purpose. To know that she thought his coming certain was enough to make Emma consider it so, and sincerely did she rejoice in their joy. It was a most delightful reanimation of exhausted spirits. The worn-out past was sunk in the freshness of what was coming, and in the rapidity of half a moment's thought she hoped Mr. Elton would now be talked of no more. Mr. Weston gave her the history of the engagements at Enscombe, which allowed his son to answer for having an entire fortnight at his command, as well as the route and the method of his journey, and she listened and smiled and congratulated. "I shall soon bring him over to Hartfield," said he at the conclusion. Emma could imagine she saw a touch of the arm at this speech from his wife. "We had better move on, Mr. Weston," said she. "We are detaining the girls." "Well, well, I am ready." And turning again to Emma, "But you must not be expecting such a very fine young man. You've only had my account, you know. I dare say he is really nothing extraordinary," though his own sparkling eyes at the moment were speaking a very different conviction. Emma could look perfectly unconscious and innocent, and answer in a manner that appropriated nothing. "Think of me tomorrow, my dear Emma, about 4 o'clock," was Mrs. Weston's parting injunction, spoken with some anxiety, and meant only for her. "4 o'clock. Depend upon it, he will be here by 3, was Mr. Weston's quick amendment, and so ended a most satisfactory meeting. Emma's spirits were mounted quite up to happiness, everything wore a different air, James and his horses seemed not half so sluggish as before. When she looked at the hedges, she thought the elder at least must soon be coming out, and when she turned round to Harriet, she saw something like a look of spring, a tender smile even there. "Will Frank Churchill pass through Bath as well as Oxford?" was a question, however, which did not augur much. But neither geography nor tranquillity could come all at once, and Emma was now in a humour to resolve that they should both come in time. The morning of the interesting day arrived, and Mrs. Weston's faithful pupil did not forget either at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock that she was to think of her at 4. "My dear, dear anxious friend," said she in mental soliloquy while walking downstairs from her own room, "always over-careful for everybody's comfort but your own. I see you now in all your little fidgets going again and again into his room to be sure that all is right." The clock struck 12 as she passed through the hall. "'Tis 12. I shall not forget to think of you 4 hours hence, and by this time to-morrow, perhaps, or a little later, I may be thinking of the possibility of their all calling here. I am sure they will bring him soon." She opened the parlour door, and saw 2 gentlemen sitting with her father, Mr. Weston and his son. They had been arrived only a few minutes, and Mr. Weston had scarcely finished his explanation of Frank's being a day before his time, and her father was yet in the midst of his very civil welcome and congratulations, when she appeared, to have her share of surprise, introduction, and pleasure. The Frank Churchill so long talked of, so high in interest, was actually before her, he was presented to her, and she did not think too much had been said in his praise. He was a very good-looking young man. Height, air, address, all were unexceptionable, and his countenance had a great deal of the spirit and liveliness of his father's. He looked quick and sensible. She felt immediately that she should like him, and there was a well-bred ease of manner and a readiness to talk which convinced her that he came intending to be acquainted with her, and that acquainted they soon must be. He had reached Randalls the evening before. She was pleased with the eagerness to arrive which had made him alter his plan, and travel earlier, later, and quicker, that he might gain half a day. "I told you yesterday," cried Mr. Weston with exultation. "I told you all that he would be here before the time named. I remembered what I used to do myself. One cannot creep upon a journey, one cannot help getting on faster than one has planned, and the pleasure of coming in upon one's friends before the lookout begins is worth a great deal more than any little exertion it needs." "It is a great pleasure where one can indulge in it," said the young man, "though there are not many houses that I should presume on so far, but in coming home I felt I might do anything." The word home made his father look on him with fresh complacency. Emma was directly sure that he knew how to make himself agreeable. The conviction was strengthened by what followed. He was very much pleased with Randalls, thought it a most admirably arranged house, would hardly allow it even to be very small, admired the situation, the walk to Highbury, Highbury itself, Hartfield still more, and professed himself to have always felt the sort of interest in the country which none but one's own country gives, and the greatest curiosity to visit it. That he should never have been able to indulge so amiable a feeling before, passed suspiciously through Emma's brain. But still, if it were a falsehood, it was a pleasant one, and pleasantly handled. His manner had no air of study or exaggeration. He did really look and speak as if in a state of no common enjoyment. Their subjects in general were such as belonged to an opening acquaintance. On his side were the inquiries, "Was she a horsewoman? Pleasant rides, pleasant walks? Had they a large neighbourhood? Highbury perhaps afforded society enough. There were several very pretty houses in and about it. Balls, had they balls? Was it a musical society?" But when satisfied on all these points, and their acquaintance proportionately advanced, he contrived to find an opportunity, while their 2 fathers were engaged with each other, of introducing his mother-in-law, and speaking of her with so much handsome praise, so much warm admiration, so much gratitude for the happiness she secured to his father, and her very kind reception of himself, as was an additional proof of his knowing how to please, and of his certainly thinking it worth while to try to please her. He did not advance a word of praise beyond what she knew to be thoroughly deserved by Mrs. Weston. But undoubtedly he could know very little of the matter. He understood what would be welcome, he could be sure of little else. "His father's marriage," he said, "had been the wisest measure. Every friend must rejoice in it, and the family from whom he had received such a blessing must be ever considered as having conferred the highest obligation on him." He got as near as he could to thanking her for Miss Taylor's merits, without seeming quite to forget that in the common course of things it was to be rather supposed that Miss Taylor had formed Miss Woodhouse's character than Miss Woodhouse Miss Taylor's. And at last, as if resolved to qualify his opinion completely for travelling round to its object, he wound it all up with astonishment at the youth and beauty of her person. "Elegant, agreeable manners I was prepared for," said he, "but I confess that, considering everything, I had not expected more than a very tolerably well-looking woman of a certain age. I did not know that I was to find a pretty young woman in Mrs. Weston." "You cannot see too much perfection in Mrs. Weston for my feelings," said Emma. "Were you to guess her to be 18, I should listen with pleasure, but she would be ready to quarrel with you for using such words. Don't let her imagine that you have spoken of her as a pretty young woman." "I hope I should know better," he replied. "No, depend upon it," with a gallant bow, "that in addressing Mrs. Weston I should understand whom I might praise, without any danger of being thought extravagant in my terms." Emma wondered whether the same suspicion of what might be expected from their knowing each other, which had taken strong possession of her mind, had ever crossed his, and whether his compliments were to be considered as marks of acquiescence or proofs of defiance. She must see more of him to understand his ways. At present she only felt they were agreeable. She had no doubt of what Mr. Weston was thinking about. His quick eye she detected again and again glancing towards them with a happy expression, and even when he might have determined not to look, she was confident that he was often listening. Her own father's perfect exemption from any thought of the kind, the entire deficiency in him of all such sort of penetration or suspicion, was a most comfortable circumstance. Happily he was not farther from approving matrimony than from foreseeing it. Though always objecting to every marriage that was arranged, he never suffered beforehand from the apprehension of any. It seemed as if he could not think so ill of any two persons' understanding as to suppose they meant to marry till it were proved against them. She blessed the favouring blindness. He could now, without the drawback of a single unpleasant surmise, without a glance forward at any possible treachery in his guest, give way to all his natural kind-hearted civility in solicitous inquiries after Mr. Frank Churchill's accommodation on his journey, through the sad evils of sleeping 2 nights on the road, and express very genuine unmixed anxiety to know that he had certainly escaped catching cold, which, however, he could not allow him to feel quite assured of himself till after another night. A reasonable visit paid, Mr. Weston began to move. He must be going. He had business at the Crown about his hay, and a great many errands for Mrs. Weston at Ford's, but he need not hurry anybody else. His son, too well bred to hear the hint, rose immediately also, saying, "As you are going farther on business, sir, I will take the opportunity of paying a visit, which must be paid some day or other, and therefore may as well be paid now. I have the honour of being acquainted with a neighbour of yours," turning to Emma, "a lady residing in or near Highbury, a family of the name of Fairfax. I shall have no difficulty, I suppose, in finding the house, though Fairfax, I believe, is not the proper name. I should rather say Barnes or Bates. Do you know any family of that name?" "To be sure we do," cried his father. "Mrs. Bates, we passed her house. I saw Miss Bates at the window. True, true, you are acquainted with Miss Fairfax. I remember you knew her at Weymouth, and a fine girl she is. Call upon her by all means." "There is no necessity for my calling this morning," said the young man. "Another day would do as well, but there was that degree of acquaintance at Weymouth which—" "Oh, go to-day, go to-day. Do not defer it. What is right to be done cannot be done too soon. And besides, I must give you a hint, Frank. Any want of attention to her here should be carefully avoided. You saw her with the Campbells when she was the equal of everybody she mixed with, but here she is with a poor old grandmother who has barely enough to live on. If you do not call early, it will be a slight." The son looked convinced. "I have heard her speak of the acquaintance," said Emma. "She is a very elegant young woman." He agreed to it, but with so quiet a "yes," as inclined her almost to doubt his real concurrence, and yet there must be a very distinct sort of elegance for the fashionable world if Jane Fairfax could be thought only ordinarily gifted with it. "If you were never particularly struck by her manners before," said she, "I think you will to-day. You will see her to advantage. See her and hear her. No, I am afraid you will not hear her at all, for she has an aunt who never holds her tongue." "You are acquainted with Miss Jane Fairfax, sir, are you?" said Mr. Woodhouse, always the last to make his way in conversation. "Then give me leave to assure you that you will find her a very agreeable young lady. She is staying here on a visit to her grandmamma and aunt, very worthy people. I have known them all my life. They will be extremely glad to see you, I am sure, and one of my servants shall go with you to show you the way." "My dear sir, upon no account in the world. My father can direct me."
"But your father is not going so far. He is only going to the Crown, quite on the other side of the street, and there are a great many houses. You might be very much at a loss, and it is a very dirty walk, unless you keep on the footpath. But my coachman can tell you where you had best cross the street."
Mr. Frank Churchill still declined it, looking as serious as he could, and his father gave his hearty support by calling out, "My good friend, this is quite unnecessary. Frank knows a puddle of water when he sees it, and as to Mrs. Bates, he may get there from the Crown in a hop, step, and jump." They were permitted to go alone, and with a cordial nod from one, and a graceful bow from the other, the two gentlemen took leave. Emma remained very well pleased with this beginning of the acquaintance, and could now engage to think of them all at Randalls any hour of the day, with full confidence in their comfort. End of chapter 5.
All right. Frank Churchill has arrived. I know, right? So, wow. Okay, so our first chapter today was just snark about Mr. Elton and his wife, but also about poor Harriet. And that Harriet, there's nothing, the breeze blows lightly and it's going to make her think of Mr. Elton. The poor girl is just not going to be able to escape very easily from, had her sights set on him for quite some time. So that's just sad. But then we get into our next chapter. And as I warned you, Emma allowed Harriet to stay 14 minutes. 14 big ol' honkin' minutes at the Martins. But we also know that Mr. Martin created a bower of espalier trees. And again, that says something. And Emma says in this chapter, it's such a shame that the Martins aren't higher up in society because they're so deserving. If they'd just been a little bit higher, everything would be fine. I don't know what kind of algorithm it would require on Emma's part, but clearly something. And I was thinking, this is way back at the beginning of this book when I did the episode called Confirmation Bias. This is part of the problem with confirmation bias. Our brains get stuck into grooves. Even 21-year-old brains get stuck into grooves. And it's a self-fulfilling dopamine machine. So when you find things that validate how you already think, it makes you feel good, which is why people doom scroll on phones or watch television news that just drives them crazy and makes them angry and scared. And it's very hard to stop doing those things because you get that dopamine hit. The more often you say something, especially saying it out loud, but also say it to yourself, the more you gouge those paths into your brain and the harder it is to get out from them. Unless you have a particularly plastic brain, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean plastic, like plastic is like plastique. It's moldable, it's malleable. Emma is no different. She may be young, but she is still human. And she started off with this reaction to the Martins, and getting her to change her mind on this is going to take some time. But the good thing is she is paying attention. So at some point, the sum total of all the good qualities of the Martins will likely outweigh their stance in society. So Eric has been working with one of our listeners to try and figure out why it appeared that the RSS feed over on patreon.com/CraftLit was broken. We think we figured out what was going on and think we fixed the problem. But if you used to use or have thought about using Patreon as an RSS feed for a podcatcher so that you can listen to CraftLit wherever you want, but through the Patreon infrastructure itself, this would be a time to update it. Either on the screen or in the show notes, you'll see a screenshot of where to go to get that RSS feed from. I highly recommend you do that again and see if that isn't solving any problems you may have had or problems that you didn't know you had. And we do have some new Peace Pockets in the Etsy store. Thank you very much to those of you who've already gone over and bought one of them from me. That was so exciting. I have at least 2, maybe 3 more by the time this airs. And pictures for those will be in the show notes or on the screen. And in fact, to this end, I have an email that Merita from Denmark sent in. saying, I have a question about Mr. Robert Martin. Mr. Knightley describes him as a gentleman farmer, but you get the overall impression from the rest of the novel that he is a tenant farmer working on Mr. Knightley's land. I don't have a firm grasp on what being a gentleman farmer entails, but judging from the description of Gilbert Markham in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, it must be a man who at least owns his own land, which, as I understand, Robert Martin does not. Is Mr. Knightley merely talking Mr. Martin up, trying to give Emma a good impression of his situation, or might you call a tenant farmer a gentleman farmer if he is well educated and successful? And I thought this was an excellent question that I too have. I have not found a definitive answer on this, one way or the other. So if you know anything, please email heather@craftlit.com or call 206-350-1642 and let us all know. I've been wrestling with this too, Merita, and I think a couple things. We know from The Tenant of Wildfell Hall that Gilbert Markham's father had some kind of standing. And so there was a familial history that was there. There was something that put them a step up. It absolutely sounds like the Martins are tenant farmers, but the more I keep hearing in the story about how Donwell Abbey apportions its land, it almost sounds like he must have a familial lease or a long-term situation that he's not really paying rent necessarily. He's working the land, but there has to be some, you're right, there has to be some kind of level between Mr. Martin and Gilbert Markham. So it's an excellent question. I have not found the answer yet. So yeah, if anybody knows, you can leave a note in the comments on YouTube. You can email, you can leave a comment on the podcast, however you can. But let us know if you know anything about that. It is an interesting and important, I think, question to know more about, especially as we start to watch Emma maybe sort of change her mind. Frank Churchill. According to Mr. Weston, Frank Churchill is supposed to arrive tomorrow for dinner. Fine. Emma expects that the day after that, the Westons will bring Frank over to introduce to her and her father. She comes downstairs the next day, the day of Frank's arrival, at noon, and Mr. Weston and Frank are there. He has gotten to his father's house a half day early. He has gotten to Emma's house a full day early. That's why it's the visit to Highbury that she's calculating by when she says he's here a whole day early. I also loved before that Mrs. Weston kind of whispers to Emma, think of me at 4:00 tomorrow. I'm going to need your thoughts and prayers. And Mr. Weston has great ears because she said that purposefully, it says in the book, quietly, just for Emma to hear. And then he's like, 4:00? Depend you'll be here by 3. And like father, like son, except son is outdoing the father, he shows up 4 to 6 hours early. Once Emma hears that Frank is on the way for realsies this time, she looks around her, and one of the lines is, she looked at the hedges and thought the elder at least must soon be coming out. Okay, it's February, and elder flowers don't generally show up until May or sometimes even June at this point in time. So when you talk about putting on rose-tinted glasses, she is putting on every tint of glasses that she could possibly find. And just all of a sudden, the world is a bright, happy, and shiny place again. And then you heard poor Harriet saying, oh, is Frank going to go through Oxford and Bath before he gets here? Because Mr. Elton is in Bath. No, Harriet. Sadly, no. There is a faux pas in here of showing up too early. If you showed up too early for spending 20 days with somebody, you may show up and find that your room isn't ready, that they haven't aired out the room yet, they haven't beaten the carpets, whatever. Mrs. Weston is a conscientious enough housekeeper that we know that that is not a problem, but it's still a little too much to show up a full day early. But Mr. Weston thinks this is awesome. This is great. Frank got here early. If you know you're going to go somewhere and you're going to have a good time, why wait to get there? Let's just get going. Emma, just like she doesn't do with the Martins, gives Frank an out. and mentions that coming early is a great pleasure when one can indulge in it, though there are not many houses that I should presume on too far. But in coming home, I felt I might do the thing. So for Emma, that matters more than the fact that he just shows up a day early. This is one of those interesting things about Mr. Weston. He's lovely, he's charming, he's ebullient, he's easy. He's also has moments of being bull in China shop-ish. This is one of those, like, "Show up early, why wouldn't you? I love it, that's great. The pleasure of coming up upon one's friends before the lookout begins is worth a great deal more than any little exertion it needs." Well, yeah, because the exertion is not on your part if you're the one who's showing up. So, oh, Mr. Weston. But we still love him. And then at the end, Frank says, I need to pay a visit to at least one other person, and it's the Bateses and Jane Fairfax, although he starts off by saying the Fairfax family. This is interesting, but what's more interesting is Emma's response to Frank being kind of, she's a nice girl, but nothing special. Yeah, we met in Weymouth, and that's fine, but she's no great shakes. And Emma is forced to say in conversation, Jane Fairfax, she is a very elegant woman. He agreed to it, but with so quiet a yes as inclined her almost to doubt his real concurrence. So he says it like it's almost fake about it, almost lying, like, yeah, you say she's elegant, but not really. That there's that risk of something being off. And then there's a semicolon, and Emma goes on, and yet there must be a very distinct sort of elegance for the fashionable world if Jane Fairfax could be thought only ordinarily gifted with it. Like, if Jane Fairfax is considered ordinary out in larger society, which Emma has not spent any time in, then dang, larger society's got to be gorgeous and graceful, up and down, right, left, center, and 10 feet into the ground. I mean, it would be amazing if there are more Jane Fairfaxes in the world than there are others. And so something is sticking with Emma about the way Frank responded. And it's going to be a while before we get to know what that sticking point is. But that's where I'm leaving you this week. All right. Don't forget, join the raffle over at the link in the show notes or description below. This is for the Author Clock. It's Author Clock Volume 1, because of course it is Volume 1. It is the Kickstarter campaign. This is donated by my husband, Andrew. And on the side of the box, it says, "It's time." It's a lovely little thing. And again, we'll have pictures about this on the show notes, link to the Rafflecopter page in the show notes. And I think that's it. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what we do here, please consider liking and subscribing on iTunes, thumbs upping and subscribing on YouTube. You can visit patreon.com/CraftLit and become a patron of this art. And you can always go to Linktree, linktr.ee/CraftLit channel. And from there, you can get links out to all of the social media, all of the places that CraftLit lives. It's a nice hub that you can go to get all the stuff, all the good stuff. And I keep forgetting to mention, we also have a Facebook group with the loveliest group of people, as you might imagine. They're just awesome, makers and readers, and people who hadn't been readers before, but are now. I like that. All right, you take care of yourself. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.